At the end of the lesson, you are expected to differentiate between intragroup distance and intergroup distance, identify anomalous points in intergroup and intragroup distances, and appreciate the use of clustering in anomaly and fraud. In understanding anomalous points in clusters, there are two things that we have to always think about. We have to determine first if it is intergroup or it is an intragroup. So we first have to differentiate between them. What is an intergroup? So intergroup is basically occurring between two or more groups. So for example, this one is one group, this one is number two group. When there's an interaction between them, then that's what we call intergroup. Now, intergroup is a different thing because it means occurring within a single group. So, for example, this is one group, and there are points here inside, and the interaction between and among them is what we call the intragroup. So, we have to understand them properly because in this lesson, these two things play a very important role in identifying anomalies or anomalous points. The basic question that we have to answer as far as cluster is concerned is that how 2 points in a certain data set form a cluster. So, for example, we do have in here different points, a number of points actually. As you could see, here we have one cluster. These points, which are enclosed in a circle, they form one cluster. And the identification for these points to be a cluster is that their closeness to each other. So closeness here means what are these points that are near to each other, at least on average. As we go along in this lesson, we will be dealing with the different techniques on how to determine the closeness of the different data points. So basically, this is how we do it. It's just a question of the closeness of the points in a certain data set for us to determine cluster. And those points, as you could see in here, that are outside this circle, we may call them anomalies, at least as far as this cluster is concerned. So now, let's go back to the idea of intragroup. It's the interaction or the distance between and among different points in a cluster. So usually, when we would like to identify which of these points can be considered an anomaly, then we may as well have to think that we have to specify a certain threshold. So meaning, when we say a threshold is that what would be a certain parameter that we're going to use for us to be able to measure the anomalous points in this cluster. So basically what we do is that we identify first what we call the centroid, or the point which is in the middle of the cluster. And with that, using our threshold, we are going to now identify which of those points that do not meet the criteria of our threshold. So for example, if we, for example, set the threshold to be just here, then we could say that these points here outside our inner circle can be considered anomalies or anomalous points. What would then be the situation if we're going to use intergroup as our understanding of the anomalous points or identification of the anomalous points? So basically, we have to study at least two clusters. So for example, we could see in here that there are cluster of data points that can be found in this part of our graph. In intergroup, we always have to think that the points that we could see outside these two clusters are not treated equally as anomalous points. The reason for this is that one point may be considered more anomalous than other points. Say, for example, this point in here and this point in here. So as you could see, with respect to this cluster, this is anomalous, but this one is more anomalous. And with respect to this cluster, this is anomalous, and this one is more anomalous. And with respect to this one, this is the most anomalous point. So what would then be our metric in identifying why and this one do not have the same position as far as anomalies is concerned. So the reason for that is we may use a different kind of evaluation. So when we say here evaluation metrics, we may use the nearest point or we may use centroid. So the computation of the nearest point and the centroid will be discussed in our future lesson. So when we say nearest point, we have to identify the nearest point here in this cluster. So this one is the nearest point as far as this one is concerned, right? And with respect to this cluster, the nearest point as far as these 2 points are concerned is this point. Or we may also use centroid. If example in this cluster, this one is the centroid, and in this cluster, the centroid can be found in here. The evaluation of the distance of these anomalous points is based now on the centroid. So being anomalous, more anomalous, or the most anomalous would depend on the distance from a certain centroid, which is the basis of anomalousness of a certain data point. What is this for? Why do we have to study this? This lesson teaches us not to confuse ourselves in identifying anomalous points in a cluster. Normally, when a point is out of a cluster, we may consider it an anomaly automatically. Now, we are taught how to properly identify. After all being said and done, let's try this. What is the difference between intragroup and intergroup? How do we identify anomalous points in a cluster? Please write your answers in a comment down below so that we would be able to have a very rich interaction of ideas and that we can learn from each other. Do you want to know more about this channel? Just click these cards. We do have a lot of free data science courses for free like Machine Learning Essentials, Deep Learning Mathematics, and a lot more. Here, you can always learn an upskill for free.